What we're going to do now are two things. First, we're going to change the player object sprite based on whether it's idle or standing still, or whether it's walking. And then we're going to do so based on its direction, and kind of do it automatically. In order to do that though, we're going to need some new assets for our player. Now previously in the asset browser, we have been organizing our sprites in the sprites group. I just have the one sprite that we've put in so far, SPR player idle down, in that one group. We need to bring in a bunch more so we can do the next step. If you're on PC, you can open up File Explorer. If you're on Mac, you can use Finder. And with this course, you will have received an assets folder. Inside that folder, you'll see two other folders, sounds and sprites. I want you to go to Sprites, Characters and Items, and we're going to drag in a few sprite assets here. I'm just going to use the Control key on my PC keyboard just to select a few things at once, and I want to grab SPR player idle left, SPR player idle right, and SPR player idle up. And I'm going to drag those three into the assets browser, into that group. And if you drag it into the wrong place, that's okay. You can always reorganize it later. And next I need four more. I need SPR player walk down, walk left, walk right, and walk up. And you'll see that as before, these have a suffix called a sprite strip suffix, and we're going to just drag those in here. So in that sprite that we just imported, I'm going to drag that origin point and just put it down sort of between the player's heels. Again, you're not going to see any change here in the preview, but that'll make sense when we run our game. As well, we want to change the frames per second. I'm going to change mine to 10 and then just hit play to see how it goes. And I kind of like that speed of the animation. You might have different preference, so go ahead and change that to whatever you want. And finally, I'm going to go to the name of the sprite and just remove that suffix so it doesn't say strip 4, just to clean that up. And when I'm done, I'll just close the sprite by clicking the X there. With that done, go ahead and do that with the rest of these sprites that you imported. When you've gone through your player sprites, they should all animate at a consistent frame rate, or as long as they look good, and have their origin points all at the same spot. Just like that. And even the walking animations should be correctly converted. Here's a pro tip too. If you right click on any group that's in your asset browser, you can actually change the color of it, which is really handy. I'm going to change the color of the sprites group and just make it, I don't know, pale blue. And you can see as you do that, it'll help you keep track visually of where things are a little bit. You can even change the color of subfolders as well, but I think that's fine for now. So with those sprites done, we can open up our player object again, and we're going to add some more code. So we want to go to the if moving code block, which is right here, and we're going to be adding quite a big chunk of code. So I'm just adding a comment here so we know what we're doing, and adding a couple more if statements. Oftentimes when you're coding, you'll be adding if statements within other if statements, just to make sure that things are exactly how you want them, and that's what we're doing here. So we'll do if vx is greater than 0, and we'll add a new line. So let's see what's going on here. Sprite index you'll see on my screen is green. It's a built-in value. And I'm typing in equals SPR underscore something. And GameMaker Studio 2 has created an autofill menu for me. And it's showing me all those sprites that we just imported. In this case, this is extra handy. And I can just choose SPR player walk right, rather than having to type out the whole thing. This is a great way to avoid spelling mistakes. And as well, I'm going to set another variable, dir equals 0. What's dir? Well, we actually added that way back in our create event. We just haven't used it yet. So now we're using it now, and I'll explain as we go through. So we're going to add another line and do the exact same thing, but for a different direction. So if Vx is less than 0, SPR, and I'm going to say, sorry, sprite index. Again, you can see we got these handy lists that we can choose from. That's the one we want, sprite index equals SPR player walk left. And dir equals 2. Okay, so we've just added 4 new if statements. And what we're doing here is using the exact same code we wrote here. Remember Vx and Vy. Vx calculates horizontal movement, Vy calculates vertical movement. So now we're just checking if Vx is greater than 0, which would be, 1 in this case, which would mean that we're moving right. If it's less than 0, we're moving left. If Vy is greater than 0, it means we're moving down. And if it's less than 0, it means we're moving up. We all know this because of what we've already done up here. So we're just using the exact same code to check here. And we're saying if it's greater than 0, change the sprite index, which is my sprite, the player sprite, and change it to this sprite asset, which we just imported and processed. And we're doing that for each of the 4 directions. So right, left, down, and up. If it's easier, you can always add in extra comments to say right, left, down, and up. We're also setting, in each case, this dir or dir variable that we created, which is just a variable that we made. It doesn't mean anything in particular because we're going to use this later for some other fancy stuff. And we're setting it to 0, 2, 3, and 1, depending on where it is. Bit of a spoiler here. These numbers are because of how GameMaker Studio perceives certain things in regards to direction. We already know what these numbers are, so I'm just using them as a way to save some time. So go ahead and run your game now and see what happens. And as you move around, whoa, your player will change sprites. So she'll walk right, she'll walk left, she'll walk up, she'll walk down. So everything looks correct on my screen and she's sort of changing sprites correctly. If the sprite appears to sort of skip around, or it looks like as you change directions, things aren't appearing in quite the place that they should, double check that little gray origin point in each of the sprite assets. If you don't have those set correctly, if for instance, this origin is set way over here, things are going to look weird when it comes to running your game. You'll notice that we have one problem though. Once we stop moving, your player just keeps running. They don't actually go into their idle state, which is not exactly what we want. So we're going to close the window and fix this. Let's open up Object Player again and go back to that step event. And here's a fun tip too. If you need a little bit more room to work, when you have events open, you'll notice that as you open events, they'll also appear in tabs right here, which is handy, easy way to switch between them. But if you want to see things full screen, you can actually just hit this button here, and it'll create a new tab at the top of the IDE, and show you everything all at once so you can focus on what you're doing. And if you have multiple events open before you do this, they'll all appear as little subtabs, which is an easy way to get around. If you like this, but you want to get back to where you were, you can just click on Workspace 1 again and go back to see your object player, or you can close this and go back to the regular object editor. I'm going to open this up so we can see what we're doing, and we're going to add a bit more code. So we've already edited the if moving code block to add in these sprite checks so that we change the sprite depending on which way we're facing. We need to do the same thing here where it says if idle, because right now there's no code. We don't specify anything at all. So we're going to get rid of this line and we're going to enter in a bunch of new stuff. So I'm going to label this code block with something. It's going to say change idle sprite based on last direction. And we're going to do something new. Let's type switch dir and a curly brace. And just to make things easy, I'm just going to close that curly brace there. Now this is something new. It's called a switch function. It's a handy way to combine a bunch of if statements into something easier to read and essentially a way to check things all at once. So instead of asking if this, if that over and over and over again, you can use a nice condensed way to check everything. It does the exact same thing as an if statement, but all at once. So what we want to check is the value of dir, which is that variable that we created in our in our create event, and we're also changing down here, right? Every time we change directions as we walk. So when you use a switch function, you need to specify cases, which are the things you're checking for. We'll do one line and we'll explain as we go. I'm going to type case 0 colon sprite index equals SPR player, and I'm going to use my autofill list here and choose SPR idle right. Put a semicolon in, and I'm going to add a word at the end that says break. So that's one case in a switch function. Now to make things easy, remember we can just duplicate lines of code and edit them. So I'm just going to hit Control D or Command D on a Mac to duplicate that code. And let's change this to case 1 and change the sprite that we're going to change this to up. So what are we even doing here? Well, down here when we're moving, we're checking to see if our player is moving based on this code that we wrote. And we're saying if Vx, in this example, if it's greater than 0, we know that we're moving right. And we're changing our player sprite to be the right-facing walking sprite. At the same time, we're changing that variable that we created called dir, which is just a random variable we made. And we're setting that to be 0. Now up here, we're saying if we're no longer moving, no one's touching any keys, the player is not moving at all, we're going to check for what dir is. And in this case, if it's 0, we're going to change the idle sprite, or sorry, the sprite of the player index to be the idle right-facing sprite, so that the right-facing sprite of the idle state matches what we do down here. And we're doing it again here where if we're moving up, we're setting the player walk sprite to up, and we're setting dir to 1. And then when we're no longer moving, we're saying, hey, what's dir again? And if it's the case is 1, we're setting the idle sprite to up to match. Now you might be asking, well, why are we doing something down here, but then checking for it up here? Remember, this is a step event, which is running every single frame of your game. So this code is going from top to bottom every single frame. So in one frame, you might be moving and it's running this code. And then in the next frame, you might be standing still, which means it's starting up here again and checking down here. So we can get away with having these checks above and below depending on how the game works. So I'm going to fill out this switch statement with switch function rather, with the other two cases, which would be 2 and 3. So I'm just going to duplicate this line, make the case 2, which is the direction for left, and change the sprite here to left, which is one of the ones that we imported. And finally, I will duplicate that line again, change the case to 3, and make this the idle down sprite. So now these will all match. One last thing about switch functions. We have this weird little thing here that says break. Think of a switch function as like a waterfall. It starts up here and it keeps going down. If you don't put a break at the end, it will go from one case to the next. It's a way to let us do some more advanced things that we don't need to worry about right now, but all you know is that you want it to stop checking once it finds the case that is correct. So if you're moving right and it says, oh yeah, I'm moving right because the dir is 0, do this, change the sprite of my player to the right-facing idle sprite, and then stop. Don't keep checking. That's all we need. If you run your game again, you should now notice that as you walk around, your player will correctly idle left, idle right, idle up, idle down, and will move correctly in all 4 directions, and all of those sprites will change automatically. When you're done being extremely excited about this, go ahead and close the game and return to GameMaker Studio 2.